I'm not going to be as dramatic as that, I'm afraid.
Well, good afternoon. Just this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to welcome Robert to the stage here. I'm sure he doesn't need an introduction, he's here many times, but I'll give you one anyway. Over the course of 16 novels, Robert has mastered that rare and for all novelists enviable skill of writing literary novels that also become blockbuster bestsellers. Now we have a new one, Precipice, which looks at the relationship between Herbert Asquith, who was Prime Minister from 1908 until 1916, and the socialite Venetia Stanley. This is in the period leading up to World War I. Believe me, few political relationships are as extraordinary and consequential as this one. It's brilliant, enthralling, and at times jaw-dropping. Let's give a warm welcome to Robert.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Robert, can you give us some idea, first of all, who exactly were Herbert Asquith and Venetia Stanley?
Well, Asquith was born in 1852. He was a Victorian. So long ago, actually, that one of his earliest memories was walking in London and seeing 6 men who'd just been hanged in public outside Newgate Prison with white shrouds over their heads. He was sent to London to be educated. His father died young. He was born in Yorkshire. And he was brilliant. He's probably the cleverest man intellectually who was ever Prime Minister. He went to Oxford, he went into the law, he was promoted by Gladstone straight from the backbenchers to be Home Secretary. He later became Chancellor of the Exchequer and finally Prime Minister. His first wife died on a family holiday in Scotland, leaving him with 5 young children to bring up. And not long afterwards, he remarried Margot Tennant, a very different woman, a socialite. They had 2 children. She had a lot of miscarriages. And by the time he became Prime Minister in 1908, they no longer shared a bedroom. And into this void in his life stepped Venetia Stanley. Venetia was, at the start of the book, she is 26, about to be 27. Asquith is 61. She was a great friend of his daughter's, Violet Asquith, and she was the daughter of a former Liberal MP who had inherited unexpectedly the family title and an enormous amount of money, 3 huge houses. She was the youngest in the family. She did not go to school, but she was very clever and very interested in politics. And there was quite an eccentric intellectual family. Her father had been a don in Oxford, but had lost his fellowship because he said he was an atheist. His elder brother, the one who died, converted to Islam and sat in the House of Lords as a Muslim peer. And his younger brother, Algernon, was a Roman Catholic bishop. So they had everything covered.
Yeah, all bases covered.
And indeed, they were related to Bertrand Russell. So, you know, they were a highly intellectual, mildly eccentric family. She kept, for instance, as a teenager, she had a pet bear, which gradually grew larger and larger and used to chase all the guests across the lawn, so that had to go to London Zoo. And she kept a pet penguin as well on the coast at Penrose, near Holyhead. And she was still unmarried at 26, and although she'd had lots of suitors, there was some independent streak in her. She was a member of a racy group called the Coterie. Raymond Asquith's son, was a member, so was Nancy Cunard, Lady Diana Cooper, or Lady Diana Manners as she was then. This was her sort of set, and she and Asquith met at least once a week to go for an hour-and-a-half drive out to Henley, actually, on several occasions, Goring, around Hampstead Heath, and this was where they met in private, but they would meet throughout the week at lunch and dinner.
We'll get into the drives a little bit later on. I mean, if ever, if ever a relationship deserved the phrase amour fou, this is it, isn't it, really? I mean, it was, the way you described it, it could plausibly have just been an acquaintanceship or a meeting of minds. But it went much, much beyond that, and what the book is actually centered around really is this extraordinary correspondence between the two of them, where Asquith is basically a man who's completely lost his head.
Yes, I can't stress too much that every letter in the novel, and there's about 5,000 words or more of them, is by Asquith. I haven't changed them. And that's the kind of, oh my God, if there is an oh my God factor, it's that. It's what he actually wrote to her. He would write to her at least 3 times a day by the end of 1914, the beginning of 1915. There were 12 postal deliveries a day in London in 1914. And this was pre-Paula Vennell's post office. He used to like to wake up in Downing Street to a letter from Venetia. He would write to her at the end of the morning, describing what had happened in cabinet, and quite possibly enclosing a secret document, which he used to send her through the open post, all sorts of military secrets. Then he would write to her at the end of the afternoon, early evening. He might wander down without any kind of bodyguard or anything to the Athenaeum and write to her there. And finally, at midnight when he was in bed, he would write in pencil, presumably to spare the sheets, he would write her another letter. So it was extraordinary. In all, he wrote her 560 letters, every one of which she preserved. She kept in a painted wooden box. And he kept hers in a dispatch box in his office in Downing Street. I reckon she must have written at least 300 letters to him, and he burnt all of them.
Right.
So we only have his side of the correspondence. But yes, they are wonderfully flowery. My dearest darling. One ends, do you know how, have I told you how much I love you? No. Just multiply the stars by the sands. And my wife said, you never write to me like this. I don't think many men probably do, but he had this great romantic streak, and they're full of hints of what might have been taking place between them. But there's never anything that's really explicit. And so the letters were kind of came into the public domain in 1964 when Roy Jenkins published a book about Asquith. He missed out all the endearments, and he really just used the letters to say where Asquith was at any given time and recount his views about colleagues and so on. And he said, Roy, because remember at this point, Asquith's daughter, the formidable Violet Bonham Carter, was still alive. He said that Venetia was no more of a distraction to Asquith than hymn singing was to Lloyd George. Well, I don't know how lustily he sang the hymns, but I don't think that can be the case.
Well, lustily being the operative the operative adjective, because this was clearly driven by a lot of lust, wasn't it? I mean, there is some dispute about whether the relationship was actually consummated. But you mentioned these long drives that they would go on. Explain exactly the vehicle that they're taking these long drives in, and quite how private what privacy that would have afforded them.
Yes, it's the car. Well, most historians have not bothered about the car, and actually, if you say their main point of contact was to drive out from Westminster to Henley with a chauffeur, you would think, well, they were just driving. 2 points to bear in mind. One is that Asquith was notoriously unsafe in the back of taxis. He was, he would be in real trouble these days. Very few women he didn't try it on with. And he was quite notorious for his fondness for the company of attractive young women. Secondly, Venetia, after the affair with Asquith, had a number of affairs with married men, including Lord Beaverbrook. Anyway, the car, because you're a novelist and you have to describe these things, so I have the car coming around Portland Place, July 1914, to pick up Venetia, and I thought I better look what this car is like so I can describe it. So I Googled it, and one was sold at auction by Bonhams in about 2019. It was a 1908 Napier a six-cylinder, 45 horsepower limousine. And I'll never forget when it came up on the YouTube film, which the auction house had helpfully put up, with a kind of one of those computer-generated American female voices. The Napier, the passengers were separated from the driver by a fixed glass screen with a curtain, and communication between the passengers and the driver was by a push-button console which lit up on the dashboard. There were blinds on all the other windows. So, but the moment you saw this car, you saw that you could have quite a healthy physical relationship in the back of a 1908 Napier 45 horsepower six-cylinder. It sounds like a Flanders and Swan song, actually. So yes, I think it's highly unlikely that it wasn't a physical affair. Not necessarily of a sort that there would be a risk of pregnancy, because there was no reliable contraception then. This was I won't go into details, but you can imagine the sort of, the chief precaution would be what they called in that time leaving the church before the sermon. Right. Forgive me saying this on a Sunday.
So I think church is coming out just about now, actually.
Yes, well, good, just in time. So I think that it was a physical affair, and I think it's almost laughable to try and pretend not, but of course one can't prove it.
Right. I mean, the main question that comes to mind reading this book, and I must emphasise, it really is an extraordinary book, and it's extraordinary what he was up to. I mean, not necessarily in the back of the car, but what he was up to in terms of the disclosure of secrets and the casualness about this. I mean, as you say, writing to Venetia, yes. But also in the back of the car, he would have these decrypted yes. telegrams and throwing them out of the window.
Well, this is two things made me think I could write a novel about this. One, the fact that he destroyed all Venetia's letters. I thought, well, I could write her replies. Actually, where was she when she received his letter? What might she have written back, and so on. So that was one thing. And the moment, of course, one does that, then what appears to be a kind of mad platonic fantasy immediately becomes then a relationship when you get her quite passionate replies and so on. Secondly, there was a letter he wrote her in August 1914. Does have a local connection to Henley, actually, because he wrote to her, he used to show her in the back of the car what were called Foreign Office flimsies. This wasn't underwear. This was. You remember when there were, in the days of typewriters, carbon copies onto onion skin paper. Well, ambassadorial telegrams would come in from Vienna, St. Petersburg, Berlin, or wherever. They would be encrypted. They would be decrypted, and 5 copies were circulated in the government to Asquith, to Grey, the Foreign Secretary, to Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, and Harcourt, Secretary of State for the Colonies. They were the only 5 men who had them. Anyway, this letter from Asquith to Venetia in August 1914, it says, "Oh, darling, something funny happened. Grey has sent round a locked box containing rolled up flimsies that have been found in fields by members of the public at Henley-on-Thames, Goring, and St. James's Park." And he's angry because he said if the Germans get hold of this, they will be able to read our ciphers. Fortunately, the box did not contain the flimsy you told me off for throwing out of the window on Saturday when we were driving down Roehampton Lane. So I pleaded not guilty. So these had been handed into the local police here in Henley and Goring or wherever. They'd then obviously been handed on to Scotland Yard, who had come to the Foreign Office, and I realised there'd been a leak inquiry. I mean, clearly, which would have got absolutely nowhere, as all 5 men would have denied being responsible. And I thought, why don't I invent the man, the poor, hapless copper, who has to do the inquiry? Because that would immediately give us, the reader, a way of, I could put us in the book in a way, a kind of outrage, or what on earth is going on. And so that's when I decided I could write the book.
Yeah, this character Paul Deemer, isn't
Yeah.
it? Who's a very interesting character actually, and very well crafted. I think the way he progresses from being a sort of a straightforward copper to then being transferred over to the intelligence branch, and his ongoing acquaintanceship, not a relationship, but ongoing acquaintanceship with Venetia Stanley is beautifully constructed.
Thank you. They become almost, it's almost a ménage à trois after that, with him, knowing what's going on. But it opened the book up a bit, because otherwise I think people would find it very strange. I think that Venetia must have found it a terrible... First of all, I think she found the weight of correspondence a burden. And I think his constant demands to see her, which escalated as the war the death toll started to mount. He became under increasing pressure, constantly wanting to see her. And she had all these secret documents. He certainly sent her some ambassadorial telegrams through the post. He sent her letters from Lord Kitchener. He sent her intelligence estimates of the number of divisions on the Western Front. He even sent her, when the British Army got into difficulties at the end of August 1914 and had to pull back, Sir John French, the commander, sent Asquith an encoded signal saying, heavy fighting, I'm having to withdraw. And he gave the 3 towns the line to which he was withdrawing the British Expeditionary Force. He literally, Asquith read it, put it in an envelope and posted it to her. Well, this was operational intelligence. This was actually saying where the army was going in the next 24 or 48 hours. So it's really startling, I think.
So putting love aside, and putting the amour fou aspect of it aside, why do you think he was behaving so recklessly in that respect? And do you think he was aware of how recklessly he was behaving? Or was he completely blind, completely oblivious to that?
Well, I think that bear in mind, he was the Prime Minister who brought in the Official Secrets Act, which adds a new layer of hypocrisy or extraordinariness to the whole story. I think that there may have been an element of showing off.
Right.
He would ask her who he should appoint to be Viceroy in Ireland and that sort of thing. I think he liked to show that he had all these top secret telegrams, and it's nothing to him. He could throw them away. But I think perhaps the chief reason was he really confided in her. And that he wanted her view on everything, and that meant he had to share everything with her. She had to be up to speed, and she was certainly more up to speed than almost any other member of the cabinet. Certainly more than the king, who only got a brief summary of what was going on every day. And I think that he needed to share everything with her, and I think he was utterly besotted. He had a streak of melancholy in his character, perhaps to do with the death of his father when he was little and him being sent to London to go to school. When he began to rise in politics, he wrote, I think when he became Prime Minister, he wrote to one of his friends, a lady friend, and said, he quoted Browning or Tennyson, I forget which, and said, however high I rise, always the mists of melancholy are there. And I think that, she was useful to him to talk to. She wasn't after a job. I think if you're Prime Minister, even your closest old friends, you can't completely unburden yourself to them. Grey and Haldane were old friends, but I think he was reluctant to tell them everything.
Right. And he was obviously very distrustful of Lloyd George.
Yes, not sufficiently distrustful of Lloyd George is the truth. And also, I think the relationship with his wife had become estranged, not just physically, but she liked to go around calling herself the Prime Ministress. She was very political, talked to ministers behind his back, was famous for her sharp tongue. She said of Kitchener, not a great man, but a great poster. And of course this, coming from her, got around and got back to Kitchener. And so I think he became reluctant to confide in her so much.
It's a very good line, though, isn't it?
It is. Well, she
Not a
did
great
come out
man,
with
but
some very good
not a great man,
lines.
but a great person.
She came out with a great line. I read in the Chips Channon diaries in the 20s. This was after Asquith had been Prime Minister. She took up Chips, and it was a time of the great, spiritualism after the First World War, communicating with the dead. And she said, the trouble is the dead are so boring. And it's true, because it's always, tell Auntie Elsie the money's behind the clock or something. I mean, you would have thought if you died, you'd come back with something more interesting to say. So
Some very helpful revelation.
She was sharp and quite funny.
Yeah. You mentioned the king. I think, if I remember correctly, that there's actually a moment in the book where, historically, where Asquith sort of is going to see the king, but they said, oh no, he's got to wait, because he's got a letter to write to Venetia. So
Yes.
she was actually taking preference over the king in terms of his diet, in terms of his...
Oh, he postponed
movement.
meetings with the king, so that he could see her. He wrote to her. I mean, perhaps the most startling thing is that after the stalemate in the First World began in up to Christmas 1914, where the Germans had to reach Paris and knock the French out within 2 months or 5 weeks, otherwise the whole plan collapsed, and they nearly did it, but they didn't quite. And after that, the war settled into stalemate. Kitchener was raising these giant armies, and in January 1915, on Wednesday, the 13th of January, there was a meeting of what was called the War Council, which was the senior ministers, Grey, Lloyd George, Churchill, Kitchener, the service chiefs, French, Admiral Fisher at the Admiralty, and Balfour, former leader of the Tory party, was there as well, to discuss what they might do. And this was the meeting at which Churchill, for the first time, unveiled the plan for the Dardanelles landing, which he said could be a purely naval operation to attack Turkey and so attack Germany from behind, as it were. And we know a lot about this because Asquith was writing a letter to Venetia in the meeting, and the meeting went on for 4 hours, and at 3:30 he says, oh darling, your sweet letter has just arrived. I'll pick you up from Cynthia's on Tuesday. And then his brackets, oh, I see, I've got the wrong Tuesday, it's the following Tuesday. And on, and maybe we can have lunch on this day, and so on. Then it goes 4 p.m., Winston still talking. Very interesting. We'll tell you all about it when I see you. And you realise that Churchill is laying out this, what turned out to be a disastrous idea, and he may have been paying full attention, but it doesn't read as though he is.
Right.
And he proposes to tell her all about this top secret plan the moment they meet. So that's quite shocking, really, because, joking aside, by the time the Dardanelles were finished, purely British soldiers, never mind Australia and New Zealand, 32,000 were killed at Gallipoli.
Absolutely. I mean, do you think a British Prime Minister could get away with that now?
No, I don't. Well, I say that. Another local connection. I think that Asquith could travel around unrecognised. He was appalled when he was recognised in the street. He would walk down from Downing Street to the Houses of Parliament, and no one would bother to talk to him. But after the start of the war, maybe because of the rise of newsreels and so on, or the heightened interest in politics, people did used to start stopping him or following him. He was appalled to be recognised. And several times in the book, he does actually meet Venetia, on one occasion going away for 4 days, catching the train on his own in October 1914 to Cheshire, to Macclesfield, and then changing to the Alderley Edge train, completely without a private secretary or a bodyguard.
Which
of
is
any
extraordinary,
sort.
isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that really is extraordinary.
So he could get away with things in a way that a modern Prime Minister couldn't, simply because he passed unrecognised, and also because I think there was much more of an understanding that certain things took place, and one didn't necessarily talk about them. Quite a lot of the women of that time, and men, were not actually the children of the fathers who brought them up. Lady Diana Cooper was not the daughter of the Duke of Rutland, although he brought her up. Clarissa Churchill was not the daughter of Jack Churchill, although he brought her up. It was quite common among that circle. So there was a lot of sex at that time, and this idea that we invented it in 1965 is really not right.
But also the sense that within the confines of Downing Street, you would imagine that wouldn't be possible. I mean, here you've got a very tight, socially connected coterie of people who are basically running the country.
Yes.
And there's no sense that the lobby, as it operates now, has any sort of great insight into that, or if they do, the lobby is also a place of discretion, the press lobby I'm talking about. Now, any Prime Minister's personal movements, personal life would be under much more public scrutiny and much more media scrutiny.
Yes, I mean, it is possible. I think John Major had an affair, didn't he, whilst he was actually Prime Minister. So it isn't, I mean, it's not inconceivable. But I don't think, there's no evidence that Asquith kind of had a apartment anywhere, or that she stayed in Downing Street, or they went to a hotel. I don't think anything like that ever happened.
No, so
maybe a country house weekend, corridor creeping, that is perfectly possible, and that went on a lot. And as I say, there's the capacious 1908 Napier 45 horsepower 6-cylinder motor car. It's pretty clear that when she went to stay at Penrose near Holyhead at the end of September, I think, 1914, there's a lot of references to a hollow in the woods where we lay for a delightful half hour and so on. That, it was not a dream, but the realist of realities, he writes in a letter. You can't help but think that that's a veiled reference to something going on.
So Asquith would have had the equivalent of Lord Alley's penthouse to sort of...
Yeah. Well, as far as I know, Asquith paid for all his own clothes, so there's at least that to be said for him.
You had access to Asquith's letters to Venetia. How free is the access to those?
All the letters, all 560, are in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and as far as I'm aware, as long as you can say you're a bona fide scholar in some way, then you can go and consult them, and they are extraordinary to handle. Most of them are beautifully preserved. She obviously took great care of them, and I became very interested in the way that the letters were handed down, and why, various questions to which I can now not get an answer. And I did know Roy Jenkins pretty well, and I do regret that I never asked him any of this. But the letters, Venetia died in 1948, and she was only 60, and her daughter, Judy, discovered the letters when she was clearing up her effects. And most of them are on headed Downing Street paper, and 580 letters is a lot of paper. She showed them to Mark Bonham Carter, Violet Bonham Carter's son, who was a publisher with Collins, in around 1960. He had a transcript made of them all, 300,000 words or more, and he showed it to Roy Jenkins. And either he said to Roy, why don't you use these to write a biography of Asquith, or he'd already commissioned a biography of Asquith and he said, look, why don't you use these? At any rate, he then had the very delicate task of showing the letters to his mother, who worshipped her father and had been a best friend of Venetia, and was staggered to read the letters. And for the first time, because like many stepdaughters with a stepmother, she had a bad relationship with Margot Asquith. She was a daughter by the first wife. She said for the first time in her life she felt sorry for Margot reading them. She begged Mark not to allow them to be published, and he said, we will never have a more sympathetic biographer than Roy. And it's clear that Roy used them with a kind of shadow over him of Violet, and he was very careful in how he used them. In 1982, a scholarly edition of the letters was prepared, by Michael and Eleanor Brock, brilliantly edited actually, but only just over half the letters, and they didn't include quite a few things which were really startling, in fact including the last 2 paragraphs of the novel, because there is this attempt, they even have as an epigraph a line from Browning, "It was all a dream," and clearly it wasn't all a dream. It's ludicrous to pretend it was. She broke the affair off with Asquith in May 1915. It had finally got too much. She announced she was marrying someone else. She wrote to him on the Tuesday night. On the Wednesday morning he got the letter when he woke up. 48 hours later the government was almost collapsing. Fisher resigned over the Dardanelles fiasco, as it was becoming, and a story blew up in the Times about the shortage of ammunition on the Western Front. And over the weekend, now Asquith had no Venetia to turn to. It became clear that the government was in a terrible crisis. And on Monday morning, when he got back to Downing Street from Sutton Courtenay, where he lived, where he had a place for weekends, Lloyd George was waiting for him and said, "I've got Bonner Law, the leader of the Tory party, waiting in number 11. I want to bring him here and let's agree a coalition now." And it was an extraordinary démarche for a Prime Minister to be faced with. And the old Asquith, I think, would have called his bluff. But the Asquith who was heartbroken folded. And half the cabinet places were given to Conservatives, and there was never to be a Liberal government again. The party split the following year. And the crucial sentences that show that this was all because, in many ways, Venetia wasn't around, have been omitted, both from the Jenkins biography and from the collected edition of the letters. Why, I do not know, but it's the most extraordinary paragraph in the novel.
So when I said in the intro there that this is a consequential relationship, it's a deeply consequential relationship. Basically, it changes the course of certainly Asquith's career, and you could argue changes the course of British history in the First World War.
Yes, I mean, I think there would have had to have been a coalition in 1915, because otherwise there would have had to have been an election. So I think that, but the circumstances might have been different, and the Asquith's and the Liberals' position would have been stronger, because Lloyd George and Churchill were always scheming for a coalition for their own advantage and ambition. So it did change everything. There's no doubt about that. And the following year, when Asquith refused to serve under Lloyd George, unlike Chamberlain, who agreed to serve under his successor, if Asquith had agreed to serve under Lloyd George, he was offered any job that he wanted, then maybe the Liberals would not have split, and maybe Labour wouldn't have become the main party of opposition. Who knows? But in this mix, Venetia is important, there's no doubt. Love is important. We think of our leaders as some sort of remote, platonic, ideal figures just working in the nation's interest, but they're flesh and blood. I mean, thank God, in a way. And I think that Asquith was brilliant, utterly dominant in the government, but then increasingly distracted by Venetia.
You mentioned, or you say that you had access to Asquith's letters, which to Venetia, which obviously form one half of the relationship as you describe it in the book. You didn't have access to her letters to him because they were destroyed. I mean, I think one of the brilliant things about the book is how I never heard her voice. We've never heard her voice, but how brilliantly you evoke and you invent her voice. Tell me, how do you, as a novelist, how do you go about getting into the skin of a subject like that and bringing them alive on the page? Well,
we know some of what she wrote, or odd snatches of phrases from his replies. For instance, the British political establishment was overwhelmingly preoccupied with Ireland in July 1914, not the Balkans, because Home Rule had to be laid before Parliament, and the Ulster men were preparing to fight, and the Conservative opposition were backing the Ulstermen. So it looked like civil war was about to occur, and some people said when the Austrian ultimatum was delivered to Serbia, well, I think, thank God now we can stop worrying about Ireland for a bit. And he wrote to Venetia, he said, I do so agree with what you say, that, and then he quotes, that is like cutting off one's head to get rid of a headache. And I thought, there, you just see a shrewd, quite funny line. And a little later on, he's not able to go and see her on her birthday. She's 400 miles away in North Wales. And he says, I do thank you so much, darling, for sending me the sonnet. I do so agree with you about the, quotes, dull substance. So available to me, but not to the Brocks when they edited the letters. I went back to Google, you see my depth of my research, and put sonnet, dull substance, and up comes immediately that Shakespeare's Sonnet 44, which is a very sexy poem about, a metaphysical poem about if only our thoughts were bodies, we could meet. And she had copied it out and sent it to him. Well, again, this gives you a clue as to the relationship. She's not some sort of, kind of figure just baffled by this old man's attention. She's encouraging it. She's sharing a kind of fantasy with him. And so you begin to piece together what she might have said. That we have quite a few other letters of hers extant, which her granddaughter let me quote from and let me see. She was very helpful to me. And then after that, you use your imagination. What was it like to be a single woman, 26, 27, in this gilded cage, really, of privilege, to do things like collect pet bears and penguins, to knock around with a rather racy set, to be clever, to speak French and German. I mean, you begin to get the kind of feeling of what sort of a person she might be. And in the end, that is the job. I mean, how credibly can you create a character that the reader can believe that's what they were like? And that's what I try to do.
Did you end up liking her? Do you think you would have liked her if you'd walked into the dining room in one of the family homes in?
They would have said, "What on earth are you doing here?"
I'm sure they would.
I did like her. Yes, I think the testimony of her friends, and she had a lot of friends, a wide circle of friends, was that she was very funny, generous, strange. Lady Diana Cooper, who knew her very well, said she was very rum, and she certainly was racy. As I say, her granddaughter helped me with the book. She checked. There were a lot of rumours about her mother's, who'd been the father of her mother, and she did a DNA test with a descendant of the Earl of Dudley and established that Judy Montagu was not a Montagu, but was a Dudley. She was born to another man, and so that's how she was. She became passionately interested in flying and made flights to India in the 30s, which is an extraordinary thing to do. So all told, I think she was quite a racy, game old thing. And
so tall, striking. I mean, she was
tall. She was handsome rather than beautiful. Yes, I mean, Violet Bonham Carter, when she read the letters, couldn't believe that her father had had an affair with her. She said, "But she was so ugly." I don't think she was ugly, but she had a masculine kind of handsomeness, and she was one of those people who looks different in every photograph, and some catch her vivacity and some don't, and so I think she was a mercurial, interesting figure. We should be grateful that she was patriotic, that she didn't show any of these letters to anyone. She didn't really gossip about them to anyone. She kept the secret. And one of the things that fascinates me is why didn't Asquith ask for them back? And instead, when in the letters to her, he talks about how one day they'll sit and look back and relive the affair through the letters. In some way, he must have wanted her to keep them, and he may even have wanted us to read them. The strangeness of human psychology, the wanting the affair to be known at the same time as trying desperately to keep it secret, I think is a syndrome that's not that unusual. Odd little phrases from the letters surface in his memoirs and in the official biography of him. So somehow she either lent them back to him to use for his memoirs, or she copied out sections and passed them over. So it's there's something strange about all of this. Beaverbrook certainly knew about the letters, and one of the reasons the family rather panicked in 1960, when Beaverbrook was still alive, is that he talked about running an exclusive in the Sunday Express. I'm sure this was just him being mischievous,
right.
But I think it was enough to panic the family into thinking we've got to do something about this. Because, of course, the letters weren't their physical property to destroy. They owned the literary copyright. Nothing could be quoted without their permission, but they couldn't burn the letters.
You did say a little earlier you were going to read a piece for us. Did you bring a book on with you?
No, I don't have a copy of the book, so that might spare everyone from...
No. I've got yeah, we've got a copy
okay,
right here.
All right,
here
thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay.
We'd love to do it, and then we're going to take some questions from the audience. I'm sure lots of you have lots of questions.
This is just a little bit that shows you how I've imitated her voice and gives you an example of the sort of things that Asquith wrote to her. The book opens with a disaster on the Thames, which she misses because she doesn't get on board the boat. And I should say that Winston Churchill's wife, Clemmy, was her first cousin, and she was actually a bridesmaid at the Churchill's wedding, hence this scene, which is about 2 weeks before the outbreak of the war, before the crisis has really blown up in July 1914. Venetia was at that moment aboard the First Lord of the Admiralty's official yacht, Enchantress, steaming north in calm seas and fair weather towards Scotland. If she gave no thought to the inquest, either on the day of the verdict or on any of the days that followed, it was mainly because she had no time. Her cousin Clemmy Churchill, whose bridesmaid she'd been, was 6 months pregnant, and it soon became apparent that the reason for her invitation was to assist the nanny with the children. Randolph, a demonic red-haired toddler, and Diana, whose 5th birthday party she was expected to help organise. When she wasn't running after Randolph to stop him climbing up on the railings, she had to try to keep them both occupied, while Clemmy lay in a darkened room with one of her nervous headaches, and Winston worked on his papers and a speech he had to deliver in Dundee, emerging only at mealtimes to deliver monologues. So this is what I have become, she thought, as she lay exhausted on her bed, the maiden aunt, the childless cousin, obliged to work my passage. It was not a vision of the future she relished, but if the alternative was to marry and have children of her own, was that not merely servitude of a different sort, a lifetime of obligation? At Dundee on Thursday morning, she was cheered up to find a letter waiting for her from the Prime Minister. "My darling, you are dearer to me than I can tell you. Write. All love." And at Queensferry on Friday there was another. "It is a lovely afternoon, and I wish more than I can tell you that I was on board the Enchantress." On Saturday night, on the return trip, when they anchored off the coast of Norfolk at Overstrand, there was a third letter, much longer, complaining about Lord Northcliffe, owner of the Times and the Daily Mail, who was supporting the Ulster Unionists. "I hate and distrust the fellow and all his works, but it doesn't do to say this to Winston. Have I worn out your patience, beloved? You told me to tell you everything. There is one thing I can never tell you, but you know it." When she looked up, Winston was watching her intently. Of course, she thought, he recognizes the Prime Minister's handwriting. She coolly folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. He grinned at her and winked. "I feel like a jealous lover," he said in his lisping voice. "I wish he would write so assiduously to me." His Majesty's Yacht, Enchantress, Overstrand, Sunday the 12th of July 1914. Thank you, darling, for your heavenly letter, which was here when we arrived. I feel guilty to be on holiday when you are so vexed with Ulster, though I can assure you the children are as demanding as the Unionists and Northcliffe rolled into one. Pear Tree Cottage at Cromer, which the Churchills are renting for the summer, is very sweet, and for Diana's birthday we spent the night ashore. She is delightful and pretty, like her mother, whereas Randolph is Winston in miniature, if you can imagine anything so terrifying. This morning we went to the beach and Winston put on a curious baggy old red and white bathing costume and built a vast network of sand castles and defensive walls, ostensibly for the children, but really for his own amusement. He took as much pleasure in seeing these demolished by the incoming waves as he did in building them, and made a long speech about the folly of human pretensions in defying nature, etc. One cannot help but love him. I made the mistake of asking him to explain the difference between a dreadnought and a super dreadnought. You can test me when we go for our drive on Tuesday. I shall give this letter to Clemmy to post, as we are leaving her and the children behind tonight, so that Winston can be back at Chatham in the morning. Always yours. She woke early the next morning and went up on deck. There was a sea fog, chilly and saturating. The wooden lounging chairs felt wet to the touch. She had to go back down to her cabin and fetch a shawl. The mist didn't lift until they reached the Thames estuary. As the sky cleared, 6 aeroplanes appeared, flying low overhead. The racket of their engines brought Winston up from below to join her. He was wearing a naval officer's cap and had a pair of binoculars hung around his neck. "Bristol Scouts," he announced, studying the planes to his binoculars, "from the Navy Air Station at Eastchurch." He handed her the field glasses. "The wars of the future will be fought in the air as well as on sea and land." They stood together, leaning on the railing, watching them climb and loop and dive. Is it not a most thrilling spectacle? Unfortunately, Clemmy won't let me fly any more. She made me promise her, said it's too dangerous. I'd love to fly. Really? He looked at her with interest. Would you like a flutter, Vinny? Can you fix it? Of course I can bloody fix it. I'm the First Lord of the Admiralty. 2 hours later, she was strapped into the passenger seat of a biplane behind a Royal Navy pilot, bouncing down the grass runway of Chatham Airfield in a borrowed leather jacket and a pair of goggles. And oh, darling, it was so exhilarating. You must promise me you won't be cross with Winston for letting me try it. The bone-shaking speed along the ground, and then the sudden hollowing in her stomach as the machine lurched into the air, the ecstasy of escaping the dull earth, and seeing the familiar fall away, then tilt on its axis and become entirely unfamiliar. Summer-scorched fields dotted with tiny cattle, narrow brown lanes, church towers, miniature horses and carts, a limitless grey sea flecked by white waves and edged by a 10-mile line of surf breaking along the Essex coast. The rush of the wind in her face, mingling with the racket of the engine and the scent of petrol, the danger of it, the possibility, the freedom.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, let's. Anybody got a question? You, sir, you had your hand up first of all. Robert, you've. Wait a second for a microphone so everybody can hear.
Robert, since your very first novel, you've attacked an extraordinary range of topics. How do you go about choosing what is going to be the subject of a novel next time around?
Well, they are a big range of topics, but in a sense they're all preoccupied with the same things. So I think, take my preoccupations from period to period. Cicero's Rome, France in the 19th century, or to 1914-15. I'm interested in power, and I'm interested in public events, I suppose, and their impact on individuals. And so I think that's what I go around looking for. And in a sense, it doesn't matter what the period is. If it dramatizes those issues that interest me, it's great fun to think myself back into that era. When I read Margot Asquith's war journals when they came about 10 years ago, which I found fascinating, and I found this magic world of the Asquiths and the political class at that time wonderful. And the moment I hit on the idea of Venetia, then I saw that this was an opportunity to yet again write about a prime minister and the stresses of strains of that job. And I find, oddly enough, most novelists shy away from people in power or at the top, whereas I find it more and more fascinating to write about people like that. I seem to have that field almost to myself, thank God.
Yes, Yusuf. Can we have the microphone here? Sorry. The gentleman here in the front row.
The lender of the book.
The lender of the book.
I haven't read the book yet, but it came to mind when you were speaking that this could possibly have been modernized and used as a sort of spring, that your interest in Asquith being used as a springboard for the plot. Something like this lady infiltrating a cabinet minister, and such like.
Why embellish the truth, really, is what I feel. I think again and again I write novels, and the things that are, anything that's extraordinary, unbelievable, incredible, fascinating, riveting is true, and everything that's dull, prosaic, tedious is what I've invented. Because I just think that the reason this book, if it is interesting is because of the extraordinary fact that a Prime Minister did this. And if I made up a person that did this, I think a lot of people would say, however hard I work to make it psychologically credible, there'd still be a bit of, the people would say, well, it's interesting, but I don't believe for a second the Prime Minister would have behaved like that. Maybe nowadays we've changed our view, given what's happened over the last few years. But that's one of the reasons I like to write about the past and to like quite often to put in factual things, because the actual truth of our lives and what we lived through, the era of Trump, for instance, is so grotesque and extraordinary that almost nothing you can make up can match it. So it's useful to go to the past, actually, and say, you think people are crazy now? Well, they've always been crazy. Look at how they've behaved over the centuries. I think that that's a value of historical fiction, actually.
Yeah, let's try this one.
When you were writing about a fictional modern Prime Minister very similar to Tony Blair, you suggested that they were very good at reflecting on what had happened, on their feelings and so on. It was a succession of events. Looking at Asquith and politicians of that age, do you think the same personality trait shone through?
I think that's a very interesting question. Certainly quite a lot of modern politicians, they live in the moment. They don't really want to look at the past. I remember a great friend of mine, Anthony Howard, the political writer, was the ghostwriter on Michael Heseltine's memoirs. And he said he would say to him, but how did you feel at that moment? Or when John Major entered the leadership race and you realised you weren't going to be Prime Minister? And he had no memory. He had no instinct. He was just going on to the next thing. In fact, the whole concept of writing your memoirs was alien to that kind of man of action figure. So I think there are certain politicians of whom that's true. I think Asquith was quite reflective about himself. And other political leaders like Churchill and indeed Cicero, with whom we have certain things in common, they lived their lives like they were the stars of a dramatic performance. I think the same could be probably said of Johnson, that they are constantly thinking of themselves and the world that's going on around them. They're writing the narrative, as it were, even as they're living through it. So I think they're all sort of different types.
Right at the back.
Hello. Two things. About 10 years ago, I was here at the Literary Festival, and Anna Corsi was speaking about her book, Margot at War. Did you know that book?
I do, yes.
Okay. And the second thing was that you started this talk by saying that you thought Asquith was an incredibly clever, able person. From everything you've said, I'm quite surprised by that judgment, because he sounds like an arrogant, entitled, self-involved idiot.
Well, I hate to break it to you, but the two things are not mutually exclusive. I think if you look at just pure intellect, I mean, he won scholarships to Oxford, he won every prize at Oxford, he was president of the Oxford Union, he was a brilliant lawyer. I think these were the days when they would toss quotes from Thucydides and Herodotus back and forth across the cabinet table. I mean, they were supremely clever. So to that extent, when I say he was the cleverest man, intellectually, in terms of all the prizes, he was the cleverest. But of course, clever people can be bloody fools at the same time. And I did read Andy Corse's book, and I realized, to my horror, actually, I've forgotten to list it in the acknowledgements, which I must make amends for, actually, because it is a very good book, written with great sympathy about Margot, who's an interesting woman.
Yes, madam, you. Hold on one second. Let's get the microphone to you so we can all hear.
I've recently finished a book about the Wyndham sisters, and I noted in that book that the elder sister was a very close friend of Asquith and went on being a close friend. So maybe he needed women to, confide in and so on, because it was extremely interesting, and all three sisters were friends. Of course, they moved in that circle.
Yes.
Is this the case?
He had this collection of young women that he used to like to see all the time. And when he became Prime Minister in 1908, that Margot derisively referred to as the harem. And I think that they were just pretty 20-something women, and he may well have put his hand on their knee or something like that, but I don't think it went much further than that, and certainly Margot was willing to tolerate that. I think Venetia was in a different category. When things broke up with Venetia, he immediately tried it on with her sister, Sylvia, and she told him to not be so silly. I mean, he tried to kiss her or something. And she said, I wasn't having any of that. I don't have the necessary component parts that Venetia had. What on earth that means, I've puzzled over that phrase for quite some time, I can tell you. And then the following year, just before he lost office, Cynthia Asquith, in her diary, recounts him taking out 3 married women, one after another, in his car, each of them coming back shocked and appalled with their clothes disarranged because of what the Prime Minister had tried on. And one of them, their husband, was there. Another, the husband was away serving at the front. So he was incorrigible. And I'm getting a bit tired of this constant complaint from the present Earl of Oxford and Asquith that it's impossible that there could have been a physical affair. I mean, it's almost impossible there couldn't have been a physical affair when you start to put together all the evidence. I think that, and to give him his fairness, I think a lot of this was romantic, and he had a long correspondence with a married woman when it was clear he was no longer had these kind of thoughts that he just needed female company. He loved women, I think, quite genuinely so, and was socially adept and charming, and was interested in gossip and so on. He was interested in life. He liked to have a lunch party every day. During the war, he liked to have a dinner party every evening. He liked to play bridge every night. He liked to drink a lot. He was known as Squiffy. He liked to play golf every weekend, often at Huntercombe near here. And he liked to go and stay at a smart country house. He used Walmer Castle quite a lot. And there's a letter he writes to Venetia in December 1914 saying he was driving back from the golf course on Saturday afternoon with Lady Tree. And she said to him, "Tell me, Mr. Asquith, do you take an interest in the war at all?" And he wrote to Venetia rather sharp, I thought. And the fact that she said it and the fact that he told the story against himself, there are the two halves of the man in a way. It was irresponsible. He was self-indulgent, but he had a certain self-knowledge at the same time. I think he's a fascinating human being in any case.
Got time for one more question, if anybody would like to. Yes, you, with the glasses.
Robert, I'm sure you're not going to retire yet. Can you give us any hints as what's coming next in a film or a book?
Well, the film you saw, that's very good, I'm glad to say. No, nothing to do with me, except that I wrote the characters, quite a lot of the dialogue, the plot, and so on.
So nothing to do with you then?
No, but it's brilliantly directed and acted, and that's great. It doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it is marvellous to see that happen. And I don't know what I'm going to do next. I have a mild hankering to do another Roman novel, but I don't know whether that's met with a groan here or enthusiasm. Would anyone be interested in another Roman book? Yeah, okay. And how many people would think, oh my God, the ones I can't read are the Roman books? One gentleman here. I'll see you afterwards, sir, if I may. Thank you. So yeah, no, I do have an idea, and if I don't write, I don't have any hobbies. I mean, that's it. That's what I do. Yeah, I'd like to get on with another one as soon as possible.
Well, I think that's decided your future then.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, we've taken a vote on it.
Yes.
In best senatorial fashion. Listen, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, and so fascinating to hear.
Well, pleasure's
hear the
all
whole
mine.
story of
Thank
it.
you for your questions.
Thank you very much, Robert Harris.
Thank you.